Hi, I'm Chris Moretti, and over the next 15 minutes I'll be showing you how to create bar charts using R and ggplot. I don't know why it is, but bar charts aren't as common in social sciences as you might think. Typically the first stop for any data visualization in social sciences is a scatter plot, and then afterwards bar charts might get a look in. The use case for bar charts is when you want to show some kind of count or frequency for some kind of categorical outcome according to another categorical variable. So in our case, the example I'm going to be working through is where we're interested in the counts or the frequencies of being a female parliamentary candidate. And we're going to show those counts or frequencies according to candidate's party. So that's the example that I'm going to be working through. And in very practical terms, I'm going to be showing you how to construct a bar chart showing that information using ggplot. I'll start by showing you how to construct the bar chart. And then in a second half, I'll show you how I've gone to reshape and tidy that data from its initial form to the form that I use when plotting. And as part of that second half on reshaping and tidying data, I'll be using some of the functions from the tidyverse, which are listed there. I'll be talking about how to pivot data. These examples of how to use tidyverse functions are also covered in some of the links that I've put below, which are common to the previous video on scatter plots. Because we're using functions from the tidyverse package, the first line of code that we use is always to load that tidyverse package or library, which should give you a message something like that. Once we've got the tidyverse loaded, we want to get the data in. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start from a tidy version of the data, and you can get that tidy version of the data at this URL here. The link is clipped at the end of the page, but if you just click through, it should take you to the right location. And so you would read that data in, assuming you've downloaded it to your project directory. You would read that data in by using read.csv. Remember CSV standing for comma separated value. We could use the head command, in this case, to show the first 10 rows of data. And we'd see that we've got three variables here: party, candidate gender, and the variable value, which in this case gives us the count of candidates from each party and gender combination. You should be able to see that there are some missing values in the data set. These will be candidates where the gender is either not known or hasn't yet been coded. So that's particularly the case for some Lib Dem candidates. There are also a small number of candidates who don't identify as either male or female. So that's our data, and so we can now turn to plotting that because it's already in the format that we need to plot. And so we'd start by calling the ggplot function. We're just going to add elements to that in the same way that we did for the previous video on scatter plots. So we tell ggplot that we want one variable party to go along the horizontal or x-axis. We want the count to go along the vertical axis. And we want to change the fill color used for the bars to reflect candidate gender. We can do some work here tidying up some of the labels. We use different functions for the x and the y axis. The x-axis is a discrete axis because we've just got these discrete values: Conservative, Labour and Lib Dem. We don't have any any points halfway between Conservative and Labour. But the y-axis is continuous. The key function, the one we're interested here, is this function, geom_col for column. And as soon as we have that function contained in this long chain of commands, we see that we get some stacked bar charts. You'll see that R has by default chosen some colors to assign to each of these values of the gender variable. We can improve the plot by adding a label for our fill scale, adding a title, and adding a caption which is going to tell the reader or the viewer the source of the data. And then finally, we can add a theme, which in this case just adds a black box around the plot area. I would prefer typically to put the plot legend, the legend for the fill at the bottom, but you may have different preferences. One thing you would have noticed from that previous bar chart is that the bars with different fills were stacked on top of each other. You might like that, particularly when, as in this case, the values all add up to the same count, in this case either 632 or 631 if you make allowances for the speaker seat. But we can change that, and what we would do, we would use that same geom_col function as before, but what we would do is we change the position argument. So just as before, we can step through all of the different chained functions that we use, and instead of just calling geom_col with nothing between those parentheses, we add in position equals dodge. And so now the positions of these different bars or columns are set so that they're beside each other. And that does help slightly to show up some of the differences in the counts between different categories. Here, because I wanted to draw attention to the most common category, male candidates, I manually specified the colours that I wanted. So I had to play around so that the greys and the reds were in the right place, but I was able eventually to get the most common outcome in a dark red so that it kind of stands out from the two other greys. This particular example might not be too helpful just because the other value, the non-binary candidates and the missing values, they're not really very common. But we can, as before, add a title and a caption and box around the plot area. So it's a reasonably attractive looking bar chart, but all of that relied on having data in the right format, in having what we might call a tidy data set. And now in the second part, I want to go into the details of how I constructed that tidy data set by starting with a real world data set. So it's the results file maintained by the British Election Study, and you can follow the link to see what it looks like. By default, it'll probably pop up in your spreadsheet application, but that's fine too. What I would use to get that into R is another add-on package called Rio, and we can import the file just by popping in the URL. There's no requirement to download it first. You probably won't have that Rio package installed by default, and so you will need to install it first by executing the highlighted code. If you still can't install it, if there's an error message that crops up, that probably means that you need to get someone with admin privileges to install it for you. One of the things about this data set is that there are lots of variables present in there. If you've got that data loaded, you can see the number of columns in the data by that command. You can see the names of all the variables by that command. But what I want to do is just to select only the variables that we are interested in. And there are going to be 4 variables. So the name of each constituency, a variable recording the sex of the Conservative prospective parliamentary candidate, and equivalent variables for Labour and the Lib Dems. What I do here, and this is an example of how idiomatic tidyverse code can look, I combine this stuff by using the pipe operator. So a percentage mark and then a right facing arrow and then another percentage mark. So it's a bit like kind of chaining things together in the same way that we do for ggplot2, except using this pipe instead of plus. So that data, however, is going to give us data where each row is a constituency and where we've got 3 columns with information essentially on the same thing, essentially on candidate gender. And what we want to do is to pivot this data so that instead of having each row as a constituency, each row then becomes a constituency party combination. So that's going to change our data from a wide data frame to a longer data frame. So we're going to use this pivot longer function. This is the code. So we create an object called BES, which is just the result of taking that existing BES data frame and then piping it to the pivot longer command, where we tell the command, these are the columns that we want to pivot. These are the ones we want to make longer. And we want to store the names of those columns in a variable called party. And we want to record the values contained in those columns under a new variable called candidate gender. So I've given below the output of that command, what it looks like. I have to say pivoting is not always easy, and it usually takes me a couple of goes to get it right so that the data is in the format that I need. So it is a very helpful tool, and depending on your level of knowledge of Excel or other spreadsheet applications, you will have encountered this stuff before if you've ever used a pivot table or created one yourself. So that pivot operation helps us on the way to our tidy data, but we need to take one more step. Instead of having each row for a party gender combination, instead of having each row for a constituency party combination, we need to get counts of individuals by gender and party. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the group by function and then summarize so that we record the number of observations. So we're getting frequencies again. So let me walk you through the code. We're creating a new object called dat, which is the result of taking this existing BES data frame and piping it to the group by command, where we are grouping by combinations of party and gender. We then want to take that grouped output and then say for each group, summarize that grouping such that you create a new variable called value, which is the result of calling this n function, which just gives us the number of observations. So what we end up with is a data frame where we've got 3 variables: party, candidate gender, and value. And so we see that in the first row we've got Conservative candidates who are female, and we see there are 194 of them. So we've taken a data frame which had lots of different rows, as many constituencies as there are multiplied by as many parties as we have and as many genders as we have, to a much more concise, summarized representation. We might want to tidy up a little bit. We might want to change the text of that variable party, get rid of that redundant PPC sex 19. That was only useful when we had it as a variable name. We might want to get rid of any observations with missing values. So what we would do, we would overwrite the existing object dat and set that to be the result of taking that, piping it to the filter command and saying, take everything which is not NA. So that exclamation mark there, that's just saying not. So if something is not NA for candidate gender, that's good. We want to keep that in. And then, once you've got all those non-NA observations, we can go on to mutate one of our variables. We want to take the existing party variable and substitute that text, PPC sex 19, replace it with nothing. And that should give you more or less the tidy data frame that we started with at the beginning. So that second part isn't strictly necessary, but I thought I would show you how one of these workflows might work in practice. If you want to think about how you could extend this, I've listed a number of steps you might want to think about. You could do this information for multiple elections. You might want to plot proportions instead of raw numbers. You might just want to engage your aesthetic side and think, well, how do I play around with color to draw attention to particular categories? Are there particular color schemes which work for me? But all that is the kind of thing that I leave you to do at your own leisure.